Voici donc Titilola Akintola.
To begin this evening, let's do a little quiz. On your screen, you have two big circles, and within those two circles, you have two smaller squares. I would like for you to please tell me which of those smaller squares appears to be lighter in color. Any takers? Box A, box B? Wonderful. So we can notice that even though those two boxes are the exact same hue of gray, box B appears to be lighter. This is an example of something called a contrast effect. And it happens because the reference point for box B, that's the black circle that's around it, is quite starkly different from the box itself. And so what your brain does is that it interprets and perceives that box to be much lighter in comparison. So we're going to come back to contrast effects in a few seconds, but first let's talk about pain and some different kind of expectations that we can have and how they can influence how we feel pain. The scientist and philosopher René Descartes was one of the first people to postulate this dual nature of pain. And in the 1600s, he published this very famous work that many of us know called The Treatise of Man. In more recent times, we have another official definition, and the IASP states that pain is an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience that is associated with actual or potential tissue damage. What I want you to remember from this definition is that pain has a sensory but also an emotional component. So when we feel pain, pain can really affect our emotions or our affective state. But not only can we have this direction, our emotional state can also affect how we perceive pain. What I have in this illustration is something that tries to describe the affective expectancy model. And this model appears complex, but it's really simple. What it tries to do is to tell us the different kinds of ways that our emotions can predict or affect how we feel pain. So in the example of pain, for instance, you have an expectation. An expectation would be your prior experience with pain with your doctor, or any expectation you have about an upcoming pain experience. If that expectation or reference point that you have is any different from the pain that you actually experience, what happens is you generate an expectation violation. Simply put, the thinking is that that expectation violation can generate an emotion. This could be fear, this could be surprise, it could be excitement for those who do enjoy pain, but it could be sadness. And the idea is that that emotion, that affect, goes back to affect how we actually feel and perceive the stimulus. And it can be in two ways. You could have an assimilation, which means that the emotion makes you perceive the pain similarly to what you expected. Or you could have an opposite effect, where that emotion helps you or makes you to perceive the stimulus very different and maybe even opposite from what you expected. So assimilation is something that many of us researchers like myself or clinicians are very familiar with. We have this intuition that positive expectations really are related and can be associated with positive outcomes. But what if we actually have opposite effects from positive expectations? It turns out that, in fact, contrast effects exist in many other sensory domains, including taste, hearing, audition, color vision, and many other sensory percepts. They haven't quite been demonstrated in pain, but it seems possible that this could exist. And this is something we have been studying in the lab actively. So today, I'm not going to show you actual data, but the idea I want to introduce to you is that contrast effects could exist, and they are things that we should start to think about. So could we see contrast effects in pain? Could our expectations produce opposite effects? And if this was possible, how would we actually study this in the lab? Well, let's take a look at what we typically see. These graphs are going to be showing you example data of trends that we might see. On the left-hand side, you're looking at pain intensity ratings. How painful does a person that comes to the lab experience and rate a pain stimulus that they receive? Our last speaker showed us a thermode, and we typically apply the same kind of thermode to the arm. Now, usually, if we apply a very mild painful stimulation, they will rate it as mildly painful, maybe a 2.5 out of 10. But if we show them a visual cue that we've trained them to associate with low pain, along with that same exact mild stimulation, typically they tend to rate that even lower. The only difference here is that now they're expecting low pain, and so they feel it less painfully. Similarly, if we give them a moderately painful heat stimulation on their arm, then most people will rate that as painful, maybe about a 7.5 out of 10. If you pair that with a visual cue that they've associated with high pain, the same temperature then becomes even more painful, maybe about a 9 out of 10. What we're seeing here are cue effects. Nothing about the temperature changed, but just that expectation produced a different perception of pain. Now, how do we test for expectation violations in the lab? We give them a moderate or an average level of pain, something they would rate about a 5. And then we pair that stimulus with a cue that has them expecting low pain. And we might see some people feel it less painfully. When paired with a cue that has you expecting more pain, some people might rate it more painfully. Again, those 3 boxes, they receive the same amount of pain, but here you see their perception of the pain is biased in the direction of what they're expecting. This is an assimilation. It's also the idea behind the very popular placebo or nocebo effect. What would a contrast effect look like if this were to happen, or if this were possible? I'm going to walk us through that in this graph. One thing I want you to remember is that all 3 of those bars, the person is receiving the same amount of pain. But if they're expecting, the green lines tell us they're expecting low pain, but then you give them more pain than they expected, you can imagine this may produce some disappointment, maybe even sadness. Ouch, that really hurt. The 3rd bar is showing they're expecting more pain, but this time they get much less pain than they're expecting. Not so bad. You can imagine that might produce some relief, maybe even pleasure, right? So here we see the perception of pain is biased away from what they were expecting. So while these are hypothetical data, we see trends, isolated individuals that do show these kinds of responses. And we're very interested to understand what factors might produce this kind of results. So the jury is still out on the data. We're actively studying this, but we do think that this has implications for patient-provider interactions. When we tell people this is going to hurt, this may not hurt, if that's very different from what they experience, we may get opposite effects. So what does this mean? The take home is that though we know that positive expectations are very helpful for some people, this may not always be the case. And we think that clinical treatment experiences should always consider how they manage the expectations for best outcomes. Thank you for listening.